Okay, so this is the second section of the central nervous system video in 13.2. So we'll go through the parts we already mentioned at the very beginning, that there are going to be two hemispheres, right and a left, as the nervous system develops. We will need to go through all the different parts. So on the cerebrum, there are the hemispheres, right and left. The cerebral cortex is going to be on the outside. I'll wait for that chart to pass by. There is going to be some white matter, some neurons that go in between the right and left hemispheres. That is the corpus callosum right there. There are going to be some other structures that I'm probably not going to ask you about, but there are structures responsible for processing. There are basal nuclei. There's going to be nuclei in the forebrain, important for learning and memory. And then there's going to be the limbic cortex, and that's kind of deep inside. And we should have a picture of the limbic coming up in a little bit. On that cerebral cortex, you are going to have these wrinkles in there and these little folds or wrinkles that are going to increase the surface area. And those are gyri. So here's an example of one of them. One of them is a gyrus, multiple is going to be gyri. And then we already talked about fissures because we have a fissure in between the two right and left hemispheres. And then sulci are going to be the depression. So they're not near as deep as a fissure. So you're going to have gyri and sulci, and then the deeper ones are fissures, these really, really deep grooves. So we're going to have wrinkles, folds, the gyri. The sulci are going to be depressions that are in between those wrinkles and folds. So gyris, they look like little earthworms to me. These are the gyri. And so there are two ones that you really need to know. And there's going to be a pre-central gyrus and a post-central gyrus. And why are they pre and post? They're pre and post over this central sulcus. What is the central sulcus? Separating where there are lobes. We're going to need to know the lobes of the brain. There are 5 total. And they match up with the bones of the skull. So you already know these, which is awesome. It's awesome to know that this is something that you don't have to stress about. So there is a frontal lobe that matches up with the frontal bone. Super easy. There is a parietal lobe. It's going to match up where the parietal bones are. There is going to be an occipital lobe in the back where the occipital bone is. There's going to be a temporal lobe near temporal bones. And there's a 5th one. It's kind of sneaky. It's called the insula, and it's on the inside. So if you separated out the lobes in between where the parietal and the temporal are, if you opened that up and split it up, you would see the insula in there. So other structures. So we were separating out that frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And we had the central sulcus that does that. That's going to split frontal and parietal. And that's going to be super important because we're going to talk about motor and sensory. Remember, we talked about the 3 parts that we are going to input information that comes from the sensory. And we're going to integrate that. That was step 2. And then step 3 was the output. And that's going to be motor output. So all of this stuff in this image, this stuff right here, this is sensory. And all of this stuff over here is motor output. And that central sulcus splits those lobes. So before and after, there's an important gyri that you should know, gyrus that you should know, and there's the post-central, and that's going to be important when we talk about processing sensory information first, primarily. And then our primary processes of motor is the pre-central gyrus. The parieto-occipital sulcus. So it says what it is in the name. It's separating the parietals from the occipital lobes. So this is the sulcus that separates those guys. Parietal lobe. Inside is going to be the limbic lobe or the insula. It's the same area, that 5th lobe in there. This is a great picture so you can see the corpus callosum. I was telling you that white matter, those fibers that stretch across the right and the left hemisphere. Here it is. Other structures that you should know, because I'm going to talk about them, but I like to, this picture is really great because it has everything all in one place. When I learned this image, I learned it as a rooster. So the corpus callosum is the rooster crest right here. And then the thalamus is right here. Kind of his eyeball is the thalamus. Heading from his eyeball towards the rooster's beak is the hypothalamus. That's this guy right here, this hypothalamus. And then below that, it's going to go down to a pituitary gland that you can't see, but it'll be dangling off of here will be a pituitary gland. Other things, you know thalamus, you know hypothalamus. The optic chiasm, it says optic in the name, so that's going to connect to your optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2. Other structures, pineal gland. We don't have pituitary gland in this picture, but we do have the pineal gland. That's going to be in charge of your sleep cycle. Pineal gland down there. I told y'all in the previous video that we have vesicles and we have ventricles, and those were going to contain spinal fluid. So the left and the right laterals, you can't see in this because this is a mid-sagittal image. So you can't see the 1 and the 2 vesicles, but you can make out the 3rd vesicle, and that's here around the thalamus. Around the thalamus area is the 3rd vesicle. This ventricle, sorry, I keep calling them vesicles, ventricles. This down here is where the 4th ventricle is, and we connect the 3rd and the 4th. Remember, we're talking about when we're moving the water. So we connect the 3rd and the 4th ventricle with the aqueduct, cerebral aqueduct, aqueduct of the midbrain. I'd take either one of those answers. I'm probably just going to call it cerebral aqueduct. All right, let's move on to the areas. So your brain processes different things in different areas. Or in general, when we talk about the hemispheres, the right hemisphere is processing what's going on the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere is processing what's going on the right side. So it's kind of counterintuitive. We talked about the front half, the frontal area. That's going to be motor, and that's the primary motor cortex there. And then behind that, the parietal lobes, those are going to be sensory. So primary somatosensory is here. There's also another area that we need to know, and that is going to be, find it, Broca's area. So Broca's area is going to be known as your speech center. It is going to be directing my mouth and my tongue to make the sounds, is the Broca's area. So to make the sounds, making the sounds is Broca's area. The auditory complex cortex is here. Wernicke's area, or Wernicke's area, I'm probably mispronouncing it, is going to be, if Broca's is in charge of moving my mouth and making it make the sounds, Wernicke's is in charge of understanding what sounds I need to make. How do I need to, what words do I need to form? What do I need to say? That's Wernicke's. So know these 2 areas. We got Broca's and Wernicke's. Both have to do with speech. Broca's is physically making your body move to do the motor processing of it. And Wernicke's is going to be the thinking about it. What do I need to say? Am I going to use English or Spanish or whatever language? That's Wernicke's. So those are 2 important areas. There's another area on here. The visual cortex. I find this funny, and maybe it's just me and I'm just weird, but the eyes are in the front of the face, right? And where do you interpret your visual stuff? It's way back here on the occipital. So it's way back there. Here is your primary visual cortex found in the occipital lobe in the back of your brain. So this is Pearson's. Again, I'm sticking Pearson's in here, even though I'm not supposed to, but they have really good pictures. So we already talked about this. We got the primary motor cortex, and our primary motor cortex is going to help us. What do we need to do? What do we need to move? What motor areas need to be triggered? So that's going to be our precentral sulcus, this guy right here. And so precentral sulcus, which is the primary motor cortex. And then it's going to go to the premotor cortex. That's this stuff here. And that's going to be your processing. So you're going to have a primary motor and a primary sensory area. The primaries are just like it sounds. They're going to take in the information, and then the associated areas with that are going to think about what we need to do with that information. So we've got the primary motor cortex, and then we got the premotor cortex in the front. What are we going to do with this information? This would also be your, when we're talking about the motor cortex, we're talking about muscle memory. If somebody knows a routine or just, holding your pen or riding a bike or whatever, it comes back to you because of muscle memory. That's your premotor cortex over there. Sensory, our primary sensory cortex is the post-central gyrus. That's this guy. And it's going to have our sensory associated area behind it, somatosensory associated area. And that's going to be where you use your memory and integrate that in with the sensory information that you've got. So you know what it is that you are feeling, touching, seeing. That is your somatosensory area. I am looking at a structure in front of me, and it is gray and boxy shaped with 4 round things underneath that connect it to the ground, and I'm going to watch it move across the ground. And I know based on my visual and watching that thing move across the ground, I'm looking at a car. That's somatosensory, taking in your sensory information, interpreting it, and figuring out what it is. In the back, nothing but visual in the back. So we got our primary visual cortex and its associated areas. We also have other areas. So our optic was going to be visual stuff, right? And it's going to go back all the way to the occipital lobe, and we're going to process visual stuff there. Olfactory is sensory smelling. I am going to bring this information in. I'm going to inhale. And right now I'm not smelling anything great because I walked my dogs today. It's really gross. But I'm bringing in that sensory information, and it's getting processed at the olfactory cortex, your smells, the odors. What about auditory? Your primary auditory cortex, and it's going to have an associated area. So the sounds that you're listening to, and then what are you listening to? What does that sound mean to you? Another place in here, the gustatory. Gustatory is taste, your sense of taste. So gustatory cortex is going to be kind of insular area inside of there. And gustatory is taste, olfactory is smell, visual, of course, is visual, auditory is auditory. But we do need to know what those are. And I don't remember if I have them as matching or multiple choice, but we do need to know those different areas. Their descriptions are in the chapter outline. Chapter outlines are a great bit of information on this test for chapter 13 because it covers quite a lot. There's probably more information in that outline than you need to know on the test. We will go through specifics on what you need to know on the test review though. So we're going to keep on going. We already talked about these. The motor is in the beginning, and we have primary motor. It's going to be our precentral gyrus. And then we're going to have all of the associated areas here. We talked about Broca's area. That was making the speech while I'm talking to you, moving my mouth. That was Broca's area. It's going to be associated with Wernicke's area, and that's going to be this place right here. Why do you need to make the words that you need to make? What sounds are you going to make? Why? What language? That kind of stuff is Wernicke's. Your sensory, we got our primary somatosensory cortex, post-central gyrus, and then its associated area is here. Visual is all the way back in the occipital. Auditory is here, auditory, and then its primary auditory complex is hiding in there. This picture does not give you the gustatory or the olfactory, but we saw those in the previous pictures. I like this image from Pearson. I think it's really cool because you can see specifically what parts of the cortex move and associated with, if we're talking about motor, it's movement. If we're talking about sensory, it's processing what's happening in those areas sensory-wise. But you can see specifically on the cortex, you know, if I'm moving my mouth right now and I'm making my lips move, that's this part of the brain right here. So I think that's pretty cool in this image to see where those things specifically touch. So if somebody had, say, a brain tumor and it was affecting a specific area, we have it mapped out. We know what parts are in charge of what parts. We already talked about, we've got the eye field over there, we've got the speech center, we've got Broca's, we've got Wernicke's. I'm gonna keep on moving. We said that the right is interpreting stuff from the left, and the left is interpreting stuff from the right. So we can see this, the corpus callosum is the tissue that connects the right and the left hemispheres. If we are talking more about right brain and left brain people, language, math, and writing are all associated with that side. And on the other side, spatial analysis, visual would be right-handed, more right-brained side. If we compare the two, the white matter is going to have fibers. We're going to have fibers going all through the brain, and they're going to connect different areas. So if we're just going to connect gyri to gyri, gyrus to gyrus, we have arcuate fibers that connect those two little wrinkly sections. If we are going to have fibers that run from the front anterior all the way to the posterior, these run the length of the brain, so these are longitudinal. Okay, that covers that. Here's another picture of these guys running across and connecting different parts of the brain. The basal nuclei are going to be some gray matter, some cell neurons, and they are deep within the brain, and they are going to subconsciously control different things like skeletal muscle contractions and movement. So these things, the basal nuclei, can get messed with different disorders such as Huntington's, which is going to cause too much stimulation, or Parkinson's, which is going to cause too little, and you'll have to fight and overcome those. Huntington's and Parkinson's are not fun diseases. See a picture again of the basal nuclei. Let's move on to, I'm not going to ask you about the connections and specifics on this, I'm skipping on past. The limbic system, I do want you to know what it is, and these are going to be our emotions of the limbic system. So we have the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is going to be involved with memories. The amygdala is going to be associated with anger and fear. And anger starts with an A, amygdala starts with an A, it helps me remember. The other area, hippocampus, the amygdala, and the cingulate gyrus. This guy is going to be important with gestures involving emotions. So people that talk with their hands a lot, very passionate and they're moving and then that is cingulated gyrus. Let's move on to other areas. So the diencephalon. The diencephalon is going to have, it's going to be the link between the hemispheres of the cerebrum and the central nervous system. So it's going to contain the thalamus, the hypothalamus, those good guys. So with the thalamus, these are going to be, the thalamus is like your gatekeeper to the cerebrum up there. So it's a relay station. It's going to take information to and from is what the thalamus is going to do. The hypothalamus, here's our thalamus in green, and it looked like the eye of the rooster is the thalamus. It is, again, the gatekeeper processing, relay for processing information. We're going to have the intermediate mass is this guy that connects both sides there. It's the intermediate mass, this commissure of fibers. The hypothalamus is this guy. Hypothalamus is super important. It is going to be your main visceral control center. It's going to be in charge of your autonomic nervous system, which controls your blood pressure, your heart rate, your GI tract, respiratory rates, how fast are you breathing, how fast is your heart beating, all that autonomic control is under this guy, under the hypothalamus. It's going to regulate body temperature, your sleep and wake cycle. A whole bunch of stuff happens at the hypothalamus. And then the epithalamus is back here. And this is going to have your pineal gland right there. That's your epithalamus. Helps you with melatonin in your sleep cycles. Pictures of all of these if you want a whole lot of information on the thalamus. But I need to know general characteristics. Thalamus is the gatekeeper. He's going to be in charge of relaying signals coming in towards your cerebellum, towards your cerebrum. And then hypothalamus is below that, and it is going to be in charge of your visceral control, your homeostatic controls, hypothalamus. Epithalamus is going to have the pineal gland, which helps your sleep-wake cycle by secreting melatonin. Your cerebellum is a structure underneath. So this little guy, we've got cerebrum up here, cerebellum's behind here, and it's about 11% of the brain. And it is going to be modulating motor commands from the cerebrum, the cerebellum, to balance and equilibrium. So making sure that your arms and your legs are all moving and coordinated and that you have your balance. That's your cerebellum. So parts of the cerebellum, it's going to have two parts to it. It's going to have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. We are going to have a vernus that's in between these two. It's going to have a transverse fissure that separates these two areas with our transverse fissure. Here, right here, here we go. It's not really labeled on here, but we're going to mark it in there, separating the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Transverse fissure is right there. Anterior lobe, posterior lobe. First goes in between primary fissure. Another really cool thing that you can see on the face-to-face labs when you get to touch this and open this up is the arbor vitae. And the arbor vitae is going to be white matter, and it's surrounded by gray matter. And so it looks like the tree of life. That's what it means, it's the tree of life. So it's these guys. We've got these little Purkinje cells all in here. And all of this inside, there it is. It looks like a tree. This is your arbor vitae, the tree of life in here. Deep inside your cerebellum. And again, the cerebellum is in charge of maintaining balance and equilibrium, controlling those motor movements and making sure that everything is going according to plan. Cerebellum, brainstem. Your brainstem is going to have three major parts. Brainstem is going to have midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. The midbrain is going to control the processing of visual and auditory information. It's going to help control reflexes that get triggered because they'll hit your spinal cord and then go up. So the midbrain is also going to control some of these reflexes that are going to contain structures in the midbrain, like the, can you see it? You can't see it. Here we are. We've got our substantia nigra, the dark parts, and it's dark because it's got melanin in there that are going to adjust activity of those basal nuclei. There is the red nucleus that is going to take information from the cerebrum and the cerebellum and interpret it. What other parts in here? You can see the pineal gland that we mentioned before that releases melatonin that helps you sleep. That is most of the things that I would ask you. The cerebral aqueduct flows through here. So this is not the best picture of it, but it does. Connecting the third and the fourth ventricle, cerebral aqueduct goes through here, through the midbrain. So here it is, there it is. I knew there's a picture in here somewhere of the cerebral aqueduct. This is the midbrain leading up to the cerebellum behind it and cerebrum up top. So then we come down and we've got the pons. And the pons is going to have nuclei that are going to help with somatic and visceral motor control. It's going to help with our respiratory centers that are going to control our autonomic breathing. Like we don't think about breathing right, and sometimes we do think about breathing. We have to force it. If we're trying to like blow out birthday candles, or my daughter is using her inhaler, so she forces out her air before she inhales in her puffer. That is controlled in the pons. It's controlled in the pons, and then below the pons, it's going to be the the medulla oblongata, and that's going to have, it's going to be in charge of regulating other autonomic functions. So it's going to regulate your blood pressure. It's going to regulate your heart contractions. This is also going to help regulate breathing areas and other visceral responses. If you were hiccuping, which nobody really enjoys, or vomiting, swallowing, coughing, sneezing, all of that is going to be regulated in here, coming through the med-ob. So this is the medulla oblongata. Reticular formation, these guys are going to have fibers that are going to extend through all of these different areas. I'm not going to ask you about this. Skip it. Moving down to the spinal cord. Computer battery is about to die. Come down to the spinal cord. So this is still central nervous system, brain, and midbrain, all that good stuff. Come down brainstem to the spinal cord. If we come down to the spinal cord, we can see that there's going to have gray matter. Remember, this is uninsulated gray matter. And then there is white matter, and that is the insulated stuff. There's going to be a dorsal part, dorsal or posterior dorsal area. So there's going to be dorsal horns, there's going to be lateral horns that stick out at the side, and there's going to be ventral horns of gray on the anterior part of the brain. So on this spinal cord model, you'll definitely need to know these things for the lab practical. There is a dorsal and a ventral and a lateral horn of gray. In between these guys, they're going to meet up in the middle. There's a central canal that runs through, and it's going to have spinal fluid, CSF, flowing through there too. It is going to come down. We can see all of the spinal cord, all the cervical, then the thoracic, and then the lumbar. And I've already told y'all that the spinal cord doesn't go all the way down. It stops. The spinal cord stops at about L1, L2. So you can see it stop right about here. Where it stops, it is going to be tapered, and that is the conus medullaris. So if you think about an ice cream cone, it's got a cone shape, the conus medullaris, where it is going to stop. And then coming off of that is going to be all of these things, the cauda equina, that looks like a horsetail. You can see them coming down. All of those are the cauda equina, the horsetail of all of these spinal nerves coming down off of the lower part of the spinal column as it stops at the conus medullaris. The film terminal, that guy is going to extend from the spinal cord to the, basically down by the tailbone. And he is going to just give support. It's just there for support. Definitely need you to know the conus medullaris, where it goes into a cone shape and finishes. Where does it finish? L1 and L2. And then the cauda equina is going to begin at that point, and then all of those nerves will come down from there. We already mentioned the gray matter. When we have information coming in, we are going to have our dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal root ganglion, here's our dorsal root. And again, it's on the dorsal side, so the back part of you. And the dorsal root ganglion is going to have it's going to have sensory information coming in. So your sensory inputs are coming in. They're coming in on the dorsal side of the spinal column. Know it, I'm definitely going to ask you about it on the test. So it's coming in on the dorsal side. Sensory is coming in on the dorsal side. It's going to be integrated in the central nervous system. We're going to process that information, decide what we want to do with it. We're going to send a signal out. And that motor is going to go out the ventral side. So this is sensory. And this ventral side is motor. There is going to be a posterior on the dorsal side, median sulcus, PMS, on the posterior side. Anterior side is deeper, so it's called a fissure. This is the anterior median fissure. We already talked about the central canal. It's a little tiny hole there where the central spinal fluid can flow in between. I think that covers all those parts on the spinal column. Again, white matter is going to be insulated stuff. It's covered in the myelin sheaths. The stuff that is not insulated, that doesn't have myelin sheaths, produced either by oligodendrocytes or a Schwann cell, those things are called gray matter. Gray matter. There is going to be, again, posterior, lateral, and anterior horns of gray, which is going to have the sensory. We're going to have those on the posterior. Dorsal root ganglia sends them that information. And so sensory is coming in on the dorsal posterior side. Motor information is going to go out on the anterior or ventral side. Know the flow of information through the spinal cord. One more picture showing these things. Sensory over here, and dorsal. And motor is going to be coming down on the ventral. And then if you really want to see associated areas, just like with the brain, we have associated areas in the spinal cord that's mapped out. And if you were in some sort of traumatic accident and your spinal cord got damaged, you could see what is affecting, the sensory information coming in from the arm. Maybe you can send input out because this part right here, this part was fine, but maybe this part, maybe that part got damaged. And so you can't bring any information in, but you can send input out, or vice versa. Maybe it's vice versa. You can take information in, but you can't send the information out. So know where the input is coming in on the dorsal side. And know the output, the motor output is coming out on the ventral side. All right, so that's it for this video. And I am going to plug in my computer so I can keep this going.